Hi, Mark. Welcome to my channel, and also to all my viewers around the world. Please, thank you for joining us. And Mark, we're not strangers. We've known each other for a long time, ever since you've been in the reserves, and you are a hero to me and my son. And you're not strangers to a lot of Canadians, but I have subscribers around the world. So would you please introduce yourself and talk about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on your channel. My name's Mark Campbell. I'm 55 years old now. I served 34 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, 6 of those in the Army Reserves as a recruit to sergeant. And then I joined the regular forces, the regular Army, and the Canadian Army as an officer. I went from officer cadet through to the rank of major when I retired. And I was medically retired based on combat wounds that I received.
Mark, did you want to talk more about your wounds or what happened that day?
Absolutely, yeah. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. My first tour was in 2002, right after 9/11. I was there on the 31st of January 2002, getting moon dust on my boots in Kandahar Airfield, and served a 7-month tour there the first time. It was very much a tour of high adventure. We had Al Qaeda on the run, and there wasn't a whole lot of enemy contact. Most of them had run away to Pakistan by that point. The Taliban had disappeared back into the populace as much as they could, and there weren't too many people left around to fight actually in 2002, although the omnipresent threat of old Russian mines and munitions and things and pockets of Al Qaeda and that were certainly active still throughout the area. So the threat level was pretty high, but the actual fighting, the amount of combat we were engaged in, wasn't all that significant. But we did some interesting and exciting things into Tora Bora, looking for the CNN caves, and into Zabul province, and the tail end of Op Anaconda into the Shaikat Valley. So we did some pretty exciting things and set a few firsts for the Canadian Army. Certainly the 1st Battalion combat air assault in Canadian Army history. So a few interesting records and things like that. First longest sniper shot that held the world record for quite a while.
Excellent.
Still the 3rd longest shot ever made was on that tour. One of my snipers that was working for me
Oh,
in a combat support company. So yeah, the first tour I was a company commander. I had about 170 people under my command, a disparate group of mostly specialists, reconnaissance, signals, anti-armor, mortars, and pioneers, which are like engineers, combat engineers. So that was my first tour. My second tour was very different. It occurred 6 years later, 2008. We trained up, did a year of preparatory training for that rotation because it was a deliberate rotation. And on that tour I was actively mentoring the Afghan National Army in combat operations. So basically providing them with on-the-job training while conducting combat operations.
how was your interaction with that ENA?
By and large, it was good. It was
It
very
was
good.
good.
We were on very positive terms. They were very happy that we were there. We were quite happy to be working with them because it was fascinating. It was a real cultural immersion. Did everything but pray with them. We ate with them, or I ate with them twice a day at least, and spend a lot of time with the commanding officer of the battalion that we were mentoring, the Kandak. I was kind of his counterpart, and then I had 4 teams under me, which were dispersed around Panjwai district, working for a 4-man team with each of the rifle companies of about 60 to 80 Afghans, directly advising in combat. And I would go out with my patrols and see my different teams throughout my time there. That was a very high-risk mission. By 2008, we were at the height of the IED campaign.
Right.
So every time you left the wire was high risk. And it wasn't a question of when or question of if, it was a question of when. It was inevitable you were going to hit something if you went out enough. It was just roll the dice enough times and you're gonna get hit. And I got hit on that tour about 3.5 months into it. It was a very different tour, lots of combat. As soon as the poppy harvest was complete at the end of about mid-May, it was game on, and it was fighting every day.
Oh.
And we would go out and we'd get into 3, 4, sometimes 5 firefights in a day, running gun battles that started and stopped and started and stopped as we chased the guys. And yeah, it was certainly high adventure. If
And
that's
the
what-
ENA is right beside you.
A&A were right
also
there,
participate?
yeah. For the most part, some of them were reluctant to fight, no question about it. They weren't all the famous mountain warrior mujahideen that you hear about
Right.
of legend. A lot of them were city guys, city kids that
Yeah.
were pressed into fighting because the A&A was a steady paycheck,
Right.
or a reasonably steady
So they're
paycheck.
just fighting for the money.
A lot of them were fighting for the money. Some of them were fighting for their country, but a lot of them were just fighting for the money, and that was quite self-evident. And as well, a lot of them, most of them were not from that tribal area. So
Oh, I
we were
see.
operating in the south in Pashtun tribal land, and a lot of these folks were Dari speakers and Hazaras from up north, as well as people from around the area of Tajikistan and the Stan countries to the north. So quite a bit different group of individuals that are dealing with down in Pashtun tribal land. So they didn't even speak the same language as the locals, a lot of these, even though they're all Afghans.
Right.
They didn't necessarily speak even the same language. So it was sometimes difficult for them to interact and operate with the locals in the way we expected them to, representing the government of Afghanistan, saying we're here to provide you security and protection from the Taliban and all that sort of thing. Sometimes it was difficult for them to do that because of the tribal cultural difference. But we managed, and by and large, the Afghans fought, even if reluctantly at times. You have to remember, I mean, we show up there for 6 months full of piss and vinegar. This is our kick at the war. The Afghans, they don't go home at the end of 6 months. They're there for the long haul.
Right.
Right. This is their country, so there is no going home at the end of 6 months. So some of them weren't necessarily interested in fighting day in and day out in perpetuity, and I can't honestly say that I blame them, especially for the amount that they got paid, which was a pittance by any
right.
Western standards. But we made it work. I certainly I would admit that I had my doubts in 2008 that the Afghans were going to stand on their own at some point in the future, militarily speaking. I wasn't seeing it back then, but I was assured by a lot of people after the fact in the intervening years from 2008 to 2014, even up until present, that I would have been surprised how much the Afghans had turned it around. And I was told that their military had grown by leaps and bounds and had matured by leaps and bounds. We gave them 20 years. I don't know if that was long enough to build a professional military or not. I think it should have been, but for some reason it just didn't stick. I was injured, wounded on the 1st of June 2008. I was on a dismounted patrol, a village clearance operation. With the Afghans and two of my mentoring teams, and it was a targeted IED. I mean, we wore different uniforms than the Afghans did, and we stood out, and there was good reason for that. Even though it did make us targets, we had to be identifiable on the battlefield. Our job was not just operational mentoring, but also liaison,
Right.
which meant that when other Canadian units were operating in the area, and everybody did, because we all took our lead from what the Afghans were doing, because you want to put an Afghan face on every operation. So
Right.
you have them lead, and they go into the villages, and they do the searches of the compounds and things like that. So that was my job, to be with them, and we were often ahead of all the Canadians. But you had to be identifiable on the battlefield so that other Canadian units could come to us to communicate with the Afghans in order to do joint operations. So it was our job to act also as the go-betweens. So we had to be identifiable on the
So
battlefield.
you're saying that somebody's watching you guys?
Oh, yeah,
and
absolutely.
Had the control in their hands?
Yep, that's
Okay.
exactly what happened. There was a large firefight off on our right hand side, and that was a Canadian platoon that was there to protect our flank as we went into a village.
Right.
They got into a big firefight, and they got a Canadian sergeant was wounded. He was shot through the arm and the leg, and the medic assessed that he was going to go into shock and die if they didn't get him out of there. So in order to get him out of there, it takes a whole platoon, because for every guy on a stretcher, you need 12 guys rotating in three teams of four, because they can only carry the guy about 75 yards before they're tuckered out. I mean, you got to remember the guy they're carrying with all his ammunition and everything else weighs about 350 pounds.
Right.
So, and that's a heavy load for four guys on a stretcher going over hill and dale and cross country and through irrigation ditches and everything else. So it takes 12 guys on the stretcher, then it takes about 6 guys to provide a close protective ring, 360 degrees, because the threat is omnipresent. And then you need an outer cordon as well, an outer perimeter or outer security bubble of another half dozen to a dozen guys. So it takes a platoon of 35 guys to get one stretcher casualty
Right.
out. And so for them to get that sergeant to a location where they could bring in a helicopter safely out of contact, they needed somebody to take over the fight.
Right.
And we were the only guys proximate in town to do that. So we went to them. We basically turned from what had been a very deliberate lockstep operation with lots of security, and we transitioned immediately into what's called an advance to contact, where you do calculated risk, but basically you accept a lot of risk and you go charging to the sound of the guns. And that's what we did, was we ran to the sound of the guns in order to take over the contact from this other platoon so they could get their casualty out. And in so doing, we stopped partway there, and where we stopped, the Taliban set up a three-sided ambush, and they waited about a good between 5 and 10 minutes before they blew the IED. Lots of people walked across the bomb. It didn't matter. They waited for me. They saw me talking on the radio and looking at my map and figured out that I was leadership. And they waited until I came around a wall, an adobe wall, and walked, and I was standing right on the bomb when they blew it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it vaporized my left leg immediately. It tossed me about, I don't know, 10, 15 feet, landed on my back with a big oof, knocked the wind out of me because of my armor plates and whatnot.
Did you know what happened to you when you?
Well, I knew we'd been hit by something. As I was flying through the air, everything went orange, and I could feel the heat on my backside. So I knew we'd been hit. I thought somebody had launched an RPG into my headquarters or something. I wasn't sure about the severity. I didn't realize it had been a bomb, and I'd been standing on it until much later. But when I landed on the ground, I tried to sit up, and instead what's left of my legs came up, of course, because of all the weight on my chest with the ammunition and plates, and the legs being lighter, not being fully there. So my left leg came up, and it was just a stump, much like it is now, and blood was spurting out of the femoral artery. And my right leg it came up, but it still had around the knee, it was kind of mostly severed, and what was left of my lower leg was kind of just flopping around on a few pieces of stringy bits.
So you lost both knees, right?
Yeah, I lost above the knee on the left side. It literally vaporized the leg. In fact, my driver, who was the next closest guy to me, ended up with a side full of my bone matter, shrapnel, all into him. So he was evacuated with me. But yeah, I basically took off one leg and mostly took off the other, and the medic just cut the other one off because there was no saving it, and it was just getting in the way. And so it took 2 tourniquets on each leg to stop the bleeding, and that was the excruciating part. That was the painful part. It wasn't the missing legs so much. I think the body shuts things down and closes compartments off.
Right.
But though I tell you, those tourniquets, when they went on, holy moly, I've never felt pain like that before, and I never will again. It was a 12 on the scale of 1 to 10. I tell you.
Really, huh?
Oh yeah, it was insane, and it wouldn't stop. Of course, there was nothing they could do to make it stop. Took about 90 minutes without any painkiller because of my blood pressure. Over hill and dale to get us to the helicopter landing site.
Right.
It was a running gun battle the whole way. My sergeant major basically used a platoon of Afghans to hold off their probing attacks all the way back to where we finally broke contact, used some artillery to break contact, and got into the riverbed where we could bring in the helicopters. So that was about 90 minutes, and then it was a half-hour flight to Kandahar Airfield, and I knew that once I was on the chopper. I knew I only had to hold it together for another 20, 30 minutes. And so we landed at Kandahar Airfield, and they whistled me into the operating room and tried to play the how many fingers game with me because I was conscious and lucid throughout the entire thing. And I was in no mood to be playing games like that. I was in a lot of pain.
Right.
So I just, bring it on, put me out. And so they did, and they put me on the operating table where I promptly died. They used the paddles and brought me back.
Wow.
I ran into the surgeon actually, Will Patton, who'd operated on me right there in Kandahar to stabilize me. He was the one that told me I died in the operating table, been clinically dead for a few minutes,
Right.
and brought me back. So I don't know what you say to that other than thanks. So I thanked him for that. But
That was one of many surgery you had since.
oh boy, I had dozens of surgeries. Yeah, both in Kandahar and then in Germany. When I flew to Germany, I had to stay in Kandahar for about a week because my lungs had blast damage and they couldn't take the pressurized flight.
Right, right.
So I stayed in Kandahar about a week until my lungs started to recuperate a little bit, and then they shipped me to Germany for 2 weeks. I spent a week in the ICU. Died again there of a cardiopulmonary embolism, which they managed to bring me back from when a blood clot broke loose from one of the legs. Stayed in the ICU for about a week, in and out of consciousness, and then was in the general ward for a week where I was fully conscious. And we had real trouble getting the pain meds sorted out right, where where I wasn't falling asleep, where I was awake but not in too much pain. And trying to be awake but not too much pain was a hard place to find,
Right.
because the pain was such that in order to make the pain go away, it would knock me out. More is basically how it was going. So I was spending a lot of time sort of floating on a cloud, which wasn't necessarily what I wanted to be. I wanted to find out what was going on and understand the situation and the implications. And eventually, we got my meds kind of sorted out, and they put in a nerve block and a few other experimental things with the Americans, and then they shipped me home to Canada, where I went straight to the University of Alberta Hospital, and stayed there for a month and underwent another dozen surgeries or so, including dressing changes.
Yeah, my son and I drove from Vancouver to see you
Right.
at the hospital at the University of Alberta.
Yeah.
And I remember one advice you gave shortly after to my son, who was in the reserves at the time, and you said, "Do not serve in Afghanistan. Don't
Right.
go to Afghanistan. You could volunteer, but you told him not to."
Yeah.
So that was a good advice you gave. You still stand by that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, depending on the job you have over there, it could be a pretty dangerous place.
Yeah.
And if you're outside the wire like I was on a daily basis, it was a very dangerous place, very exceedingly dangerous place. I mean, it was combat every day, and then there were the IEDs on top of that.
Right.
So yeah, it was an extremely probably the most dangerous place on the planet
Right.
at that particular time. And Panjwai was the epicenter of everything. It was the worst place in the whole country. So, I mean, not all of Afghanistan is like that. Not all of Afghanistan was bad. A lot of Afghanistan, 2/3 of Afghanistan, north of the Pashtun tribal areas, was calm, quiet, peaceful for the most part, and subject to the occasional terrorist attack by the Taliban, operating in disparate little groups. But by and large, our perception of Afghanistan was like the Lower East Side of Vancouver. You know what I mean? Like we were operating in the worst neighborhood
Right.
of a big city,
Right.
if you draw that analogy.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so our perceptions were colored by the fact that we happened to be operating in the worst possible neighborhood of that particular city. But not the entire city was anything like that. Most of Afghanistan, like I say, was quite peaceful and calm, and reasonably well governed, other than the corruption. But Panjwai, where we were in Kandahar province, it was the epicenter of the Taliban. That was the birthplace of the Taliban.
Right.
Mullah Omar and his guys. So, yeah, it was something else. So I finally got out of the hospital in September. I did another month of rehab at the Glenrose Rehabilitation Hospital, and then I was set loose in my wheelchair upon the world. And well, it's been
13 years?
13
So
years.
how you
and
been
counting.
doing?
I'm doing good
You're
now.
doing pretty good?
Yeah, first 5 years were pretty rough. I
Yeah.
gotta admit the first.
And also, what rough on your family too, your wife and your two
the whole
kids?
thing was just devastating for the family.
Right.
I mean, I was trained to deal with adversity through the military.
Right.
As an infantry officer, that's what they do. They just keep throwing challenges in your way, and you keep overcoming these challenges, and that's what gets you ahead. and you progress along in your career. So you're trained to deal with adversity in the military right from the outset. The family, they don't get any of that. They don't get that training to deal with difficult situations and to think your way through them. So for them, it was absolutely devastating. For them, it had been better off I'd been in a vehicle accident. And I tried to explain to them, this is no different than had I been in a serious vehicle incident, on the highway.
Right.
But the circumstances, the fact that it happened in Afghanistan and was all dramatic and all of that, I mean, that adds to the whole situation, the whole emotional situation. So the family my wife and children were devastated. There's no two ways about it, and they still suffer mental scars to this day from that, and in some cases are still seeing therapists and on medication.
All right.
And that's just the way it is. The injuries, and a lot of people don't realize that, but the injury hits the family harder than it hits the individual who's
Right.
injured.
Yeah.
In many ways,
Right.
in many cases. And that was certainly the case for us. And we had a lot of difficulty dealing with the military. It was like beating your head against a brick friggin' wall trying to get basic necessities, basic aids to daily living. Electric wheelchair. They initially tried to deny us an electric wheelchair living in Edmonton where it's 30 below 6 months out of the year with snow and ice on the ground.
Yeah.
And they're going to, confine me to a manual wheelchair trying to get across a mall parking lot, potholed and covered in ice. Good luck with that.
Yes.
So that's what I told them. I said, you come on out here at minus 35 and I'll stick you in a fucking wheelchair, put you on the parking lot, and we'll see how you make out.
Right.
Approved, right? Got my electric wheelchair.
But you had to fight for it.
But I had to fight for it. Everything I had to fight for.
Right.
And if it wasn't me fighting for it, it was Donna fighting for it while I was in the hospital.
Right.
And it was slow to come. Any help we got was too late. Everything was a day late and a dollar short. And to some extent, you can't blame the forces entirely because they were dealing with a new experience. They hadn't dealt with combat casualties like ours with significant injuries since the Korean War 50
Right.
years prior.
Yeah. Long time.
But still, we had the forces has a medical system, and they should have been able to react and adapt and hop to, and they really didn't. They were stuck in peacetime, and their mentality was peacetime, and their spectrum of care was all peacetime related and peacetime oriented. So when you got a guy with no friggin' legs, they didn't know what to do. They were right out of their element. They had no clue what the necessities were. So we had to educate them about roll in, roll out showers and all that kind of stuff. And it was a struggle. It was a constant struggle because the onus was always on me as the wounded guy to convince people that we need this or we need that or whatever. I mean, I fought a class action lawsuit against the government of Canada because they changed the disability compensation and reduced our disability compensation by 40% in the middle of the war without telling anybody fighting it.
I read that.
Yeah, none of us knew that they'd reduced our disability compensation by 40%. They came out with this fancy new Veterans Charter in 2006, took effect 1st of April 2006, and reduced our de facto, it reduced our disability compensation by 40%. But they didn't tell anybody about that.
Right.
You found out when you were in your hospital bed missing your frickin' legs. Oh, by the way, you've been financially screwed as well. Welcome home. Yeah, that's just what you want to hear, right?
Right.
When you're at your lowest point in your life. And oh, by the way, we're going to stick it in you financially as well. So have a nice life with your family, living on ramen noodles and, fuck. So anyhow,
Things are better now. After
things are much better
13
now.
It took a while.
It was rough that first 5 years.
First 5 years.
I gotta tell you, a lot of it was the battles I had with the military, and the battle I had with the government of Canada with the class action lawsuit.
Yeah. That is totally unnecessary. Shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, none of that should have been necessary.
Yeah.
But it was.
Yeah.
And so be it. It is what it is. I mean, I fought bigger battles when I got home than I ever did in the war.
Oh, that's true.
It was just insane, and
Yeah.
that's the last thing you expect to have to do.
But you're also doing for your fellow wounded people too.
Absolutely. Yeah, trying to look after the younger guys.
Yeah.
I mean, I was a major, so I have a vested responsibility to care for the younger guys. So the younger wounded guys, I was particularly concerned about because they got so stiffed by the new Veterans Charter that they, if you're a younger guy, if you were like a private or a corporal, which is most of the injured guys, because that's the ranks that do most of the fighting, is the junior guys, who we happen to pay the least, and then we stick them on an insurance plan that says, oh, by the way, your disability payment is going to be based on your salary at the time of your injury.
Right.
So what you end up with is guys who got injured as young corporal privates, 19, 20 years old, missing a leg or missing both legs or missing an arm, or in one case I know of a guy missing 2 legs and an arm, and they're stuck at $50,000 a year for the rest of their lives because that was their salary at the time of injury. A slight index, 2% index or whatever, but I mean, it doesn't keep up with inflation. So these guys are sentenced to a life of poverty as a result of having sacrificed limbs on behalf of Canada when they were called to do so.
Right.
That just doesn't sit well with me, and it shouldn't sit well
I
with
agree.
anybody.
I agree.
But that's the situation we have in this country because the government of Canada does not particularly care about veterans. And in fact, I think the government of Canada, successive governments of Canada, have simply found the veteran file to be something they'd rather not have to deal with.
To this very day.
To this very day.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is what it is.
And you're vacationing in Vancouver right now, and it's so
Yep.
timely. And obviously, you know what's going on in the news.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Mark, I'd like to kind of know how you're feeling about this when you're watching this news on
Yeah,
TV.
you know, initially I felt a fair bit of despair, and the biggest reason why is well, two things, I guess. One is the women and children. That bothers me a great deal. Just the fact that we had, because of our presence, you had 6-year-old girls that are now 26 years old who grew
Right.
up
Yep.
over a 20-year span with hope for the future.
Right.
Hope that the future was going to be different. Some of them got an education. They've gone to university. They're professional young women.
I heard some of those aren't showing for work. 'cause
And
they're
now the
afraid.
Taliban's back,
Right.
and what? Back to the burqa?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's just, I despair for these young women, these educated women, who had every right to expect a bright future, and it's just been snapped away from them, taken away from them, and the clock has been set back 20 years in Afghanistan, and it's just tragic. It's tragic. So the women and children, the little girls that aren't going to get an education now,
Right.
the women that are going to have to don a burqa and can't leave the house without a male member of the family.
Right.
You know, all these things that the Taliban inflict upon the people that they rule are going to be the people of Afghanistan, the innocents, are going to be subjected to all that crap again. I mean, how many weeks is it going to be until we start seeing public executions in the soccer pitch,
Yeah.
in the stadium in Kabul? I'm saying 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Is my guess. Maybe sooner.
So, what's your thought about the swiftness of?
Well, that came as a surprise to me. It came as a surprise to everybody, I think.
Right.
I think
right.
we all expected the Afghan army to at least, if nothing else, fight a rearguard action to the point where Kabul would be the last place to fall, and it would be the last bastion, so to speak.
Right.
Didn't happen that way. The
no
only
fighting at all.
explanation is that deals were cut.
Yeah.
Deals have been cut on the
just
tribal level.
walked right in.
And they've walked right in and taken over, and A&A have walked away from their equipment.
Yeah.
So basically deserted in the face of the enemy. And it is what it is.
That explains why they didn't destroy the equipment before they left.
Absolutely. They
know,
just walked away
like
from it. They just upped and
Thousands
ran away.
of rifles and Humvees and
Humvee,
pickups.
you name it.
They're all intact. for them to use. All that
Drones, night
stuff.
vision equipment.
Helicopters,
It's all there
I think
for
I
the
saw a
taking.
helicopter.
Oh, Black Hawk helicopters, whole fleet
Helicopter.
of them. But they don't have the spare parts or maintenance to fly.
Oh, right.
So the Black Hawks are no threat to anybody
Right.
because they're not going to fly without contracted maintenance.
So
which
what do you-
the Taliban can hire and bring in from somewhere
True.
else, but
True.
right now that those helicopters probably aren't going anywhere. Although there are apparently some co-opted Afghan pilots that are flying Taliban as well,
Right.
because there was footage of HIP helicopters carrying Taliban.
Wow.
So some of the pilots have obviously switched allegiances under threat of death.
Yeah. Now the picture I saw yesterday with the Taliban in is it Palace office?
the
Wasn't
King's
that?
Palace,
yeah,
yeah.
King's office. Wasn't that quite a picture?
It was a picture and a half.
Yeah,
And the other thing that worries me, I've got great concern about, isn't just the women and children, although it's linked to that, and that is the interpreters and others who have a link to Canada, who
Now,
assisted Canada's war effort and have been left behind.
but isn't it funny that Canada stopped actual fighting in what did you say 2000,
2011, we stopped combat
2011,
operations, and we ceased operations
completely
in the country in 2014.
14, but during the whole time,
It's been
nothing for
no,
the interpreters.
no.
Now they're
It's been 8
scrambling to get them
years.
up.
8 years. You know, they let in about 300, right up to between 2011 2014, somewhere around there. There was a short special immigration program that was implemented and run. My interpreter
Yes.
from 2008 got out, and he lives in Ottawa with his
Oh, good.
wife and 7 children
Good.
under that program. But that program was running while a lot of these people were still working, because if they didn't work for Canadians, then they transitioned and worked for the Americans, or they worked for somebody else, the Australians or somebody. But these interpreters weren't finished working when Canada necessarily ceased combat operations in
Right,
2011.
right.
So they weren't ready to leave Afghanistan. They expected a bright future for their country, which persisted for another 8 years. In that time, I think Canada could have offered special immigration package or program for anybody who had overtly assisted Canada's war effort, but we didn't. And then when the U.S. announced its pullout, that was another opportunity for the Canadian government to go, wait a minute, we have a moral obligation to help these people get out of the country. And they could have started it way back then, but they didn't. And what happened was the Canadian government didn't do sweet dick all until Canada's Afghanistan veterans raised a hue and cry in the media and said something must be done. And all of a sudden the government went, whoop, whoop, pulled its thumb out of its butt, and got the Minister of Immigration, Marcos Mendocino, and the Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan, to put their two heads together and come up with some sort of a plan. Here's the part that pisses me off. Canada has what's called NEO, Non-Combatant Evacuation Operations. And we have a rifle company of about 150, 160 soldiers from one of the light infantry battalions that on a rotational basis is always trained and always standing by at a certain number of days' notice to move to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation anywhere in the world. We've got the C-17 Globemaster aircraft. We've got 4 of them that can fly into austere airfields. We've got Hercules aircraft that can do the same thing, even more austere airfields. We've got the people that are trained to conduct a non-combatant evacuation operation, and we didn't do it. We could have done it. We had all the bits and pieces that were necessary to do it, and the government of Canada dragged its friggin' heels. And it dragged its heels, and it dragged its heels, and it dragged its heels until the veterans said enough is enough, do something. And so they did, but it was too late and too little. Too little, too late, which seems to be, you know, if you had to ask me to sum up Canada's foreign policy is based on too little, too late. So it was par for the course. But it really pisses me off because there's a family there that I've been tracking and offering moral support to that's trying to get out. And the guy was a principal ally. He was a key ally of the Canadian Armed Forces during our 5 years of combat operations in Kandahar province. Him and his wife and 7 children are stuck at Kandahar airfield, which we all know is total freaking chaos right now. He's done his biometrics. He's applied to the IRCC. He followed the stupid rules that they laid down about 3 days to return your impossible to return forms by email in a country that doesn't have the fucking internet. You know, just stupid first world bureaucratic requirements layered upon a third world quasi-prehistoric society. It just doesn't work. But that's the mindset of Canadian bureaucrats. They just don't get it. You know, no basis in reality whatsoever. So they changed their timeline and amended that and apologized for making everybody jump through unnecessary hoops. And then they still insisted on, you know, people emailing in forms and triplicate and all the rest of it. Anyhow, this family jumped through all the hoops. They got their biometrics done. They were just waiting for the call. They're supposed to fly out yesterday or today, and now there's no aircraft. They're all sitting in Kuwait waiting for something to happen and the airfield to be magically under control again. Well, we'll see if the ground troops can do that are there from the States and from England. And if they can get a grip on the airport, then there is a chance, a small chance, that Canada will still bring in more aircraft to bring out more Afghans who we owe a debt of gratitude to. But right now, it's not looking good. And this is a fundamental moral failure on the part of Canada as a nation. I mean, who's going to help us the next time we go someplace and need a helping hand from the locals? I wouldn't expect any of them to give us a hand because we just abandoned everybody who helped us, or most of the people who helped us on the last go around. So I think it's, quite frankly, it's disgusting. I'm very upset about it, and I think a lot of Canadian veterans of the Afghanistan campaign would share my sentiments about the federal government and its failure to respond in an adequate and timely fashion.
Well, Mark, thank you very much.
Well, you're very
This
welcome.
was actually unexpected. You're vacationing in Vancouver, so I thought I'd take the opportunity, and it was so good timing too.
Yeah, no,
So,
I'm very pleased to do it. Yeah, anytime.
Yeah, and I have to say thank you for your sacrifice, and thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for
Thank
having
you.
me.
All right.
Take care.